Hello and welcome. You're listening to Rogue Resistance, a podcast in support of ORD2 Indivisible. I'm your host, Rhonda Nowak. Fellow Oregonians, I want to tell you that kleptocracy was not a word I was familiar with until the first Trump administration. The term comes from the Greek, klepto, meaning to steal, and kratos, meaning to govern. And it's Trump 2.0 that really drives that term home. Kleptocracy, government by those who seek personal gain at the public's expense, that's you and me, is a chillingly accurate description of the rampant corruption we're now witnessing in the federal government. From exploiting public office for private profit to undermining democratic institutions to shield corporate elites. Trump's second presidency isn't just flirting with kleptocracy, it's embracing it. And he expects the American people to embrace it for him. In this episode, we're going to dig into how we got here. I'll start with a look back at the long history of kleptocracy in the United States. Because the sad fact is, this isn't new. From city bosses and state governors to members of Congress and even vice presidents, America has struggled with corruption at all levels of government. Then I'll talk with local attorney Garrett West, who helps us understand what the Constitution actually says about this kind of abuse of power and why our legal safeguards are failing now. I'll end with another segment of Rogue on the Road, where I go on the lookout for acts of creative resistance to Trump's kleptomania and other corruption in his administration. So let's start by busting the myth that kleptocracy is something that only happens in other countries, not here in the U.S., right? Wrong. From the beginning, the U.S. was founded on lofty ideals, liberty, justice, and checks and balances. But those ideals haven't always translated into clean government. The temptation to use public office for private gain has been a feature of American politics from the start. Take Boss Tweed and the Tammany Hall machine in the 1860s and 70s. Tweed, a Democrat, and his cronies basically ran New York City like a personal ATM. They used fake contracts, kickbacks, and even registered dead people to vote. Historians estimate they stole over $200 million, and that's not adjusted for inflation. That's back then. It took political cartoons and a public outcry to finally bring them down, but the damage was done. At the federal level, the Republican Grant administration in the 1870s saw scandal after scandal, from the whiskey ring to postal fraud to insider railroad deals. President Grant himself wasn't implicated directly, but he was surrounded by officials who were on the tape. These scandals helped give rise to the Progressive Era, a movement that pushed for civil service reform and the end of the patronage system. But kleptocracy wasn't just a federal problem. Local machines cropped up in cities like Boston, Chicago, and Kansas City. Politicians like Democrat Tom Pendergast and Democrat Huey Long built mini empires by demanding kickbacks and rewarding loyalists with government jobs and contracts. Sure, they built roads and schools, but they also lined their own pockets along the way. Then there was Teapot Dome in the 1920s, a scandal so big it made Teapot Dome a shorthand for government corruption for decades afterward. During Republican Warren G. Harding's presidency, his Interior Secretary took bribes from oil companies in exchange for drilling rights on federal land. He ended up in prison, the first cabinet member to do so. And of course, we can't talk about corruption without mentioning Richard Nixon and Watergate. While that scandal was not about financial gain, it revealed a culture of lawlessness at the highest levels. Let's not forget that Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned for accepting bribes, even while in office. Yes, he was literally taking envelopes of cash in the White House. It's clear that kleptocratic behavior has been displayed by Republican and Democratic politicians. What about other branches of the federal government? The judiciary certainly hasn't been immune from kleptocratic behavior. In the 1980s, the Operation Greylord sting uncovered widespread bribery among judges and lawyers in Chicago. And more recently, we've seen Supreme Court justices like Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito come under fire for accepting lavish gifts and vacations from billionaire donors with little or no oversight. And let's not forget Congress. From cash and freezers to stock dumping before COVID warnings went public, members of Congress have been caught abusing their positions again and again. The indictment and conviction of Democratic Senator Bob Menendez for accepting cash, gold bars, and favors in exchange for influence shows how audacious the corruption can be. Same goes for Republican George Santos, who seemed to treat campaign funds like a personal slush fund. No conversation about kleptocracy in the United States today can skip over the elephant in the room, and that is Donald J. Trump. In fact, Trump's rise to power, conduct in office, and now his second term represent what many ethics experts describe as the most brazen example of kleptocratic behavior in U.S. history. Let's back up. When Trump took office in 2017, he made it crystal clear that he had no intention of separating himself from his business empire. Unlike every president since Nixon, he refused to divest from his holdings or place them in a trust. Instead, he handed the keys over to his sons, but he kept the deeds, the profits, and the brand. And he made sure the world knew it. His hotels and golf resorts have become revolving doors for foreign dignitaries, lobbyists, and political allies, all spending generously at Trump properties. Saudi officials, Chinese business delegations, even U.S. government staff have stayed at his hotels. It's hard to imagine a clear case of self-enrichment. Meanwhile, his daughter Ivanka and his son-in-law Jared Kushner held official roles in the White House during his first presidency. They traveled on behalf of U.S. interests while their family businesses pursued deals in China and the Middle East. And after Trump left office, the Saudi government handed $2 billion to Kushner's new private equity firm. No strings attached, of course. But all of that seems almost quaint compared to what's happening now in Trump's second term. Since returning to power in 2025, Trump has taken the idea of kleptocracy and kicked it into high gear. In early 2025, Trump hosted a legislative retreat for House Republicans at his Doral resort in Florida. It involved high-level officials gathering at a Trump-owned property, clearly benefiting his business financially. In May, we watched as Trump carried out a pay-to-play scheme, where a seat at the table at his Doral resort literally came with a price tag. Want to dine with the president? That'll be a cool $1 million. Want a private meeting? Try $5 million. And this isn't hyperbole. These offers were openly advertised. No hidden camera, no secret briefcase of cash. Just out there in the open, like it's a country club fundraiser and not the federal government. And let's not forget that Trump isn't just selling access to the White House and his resorts. He's selling everything else, too. Steaks? Check. Bibles? You bet. Nothing says holy man like a $60 King James Bible bundled with the Constitution and the lyrics to Lee Greenwood's greatest hit. He's hawked gold sneakers, superhero trading cards of himself, and he's even tried to sell Teslas for his frenemy and mega donor Elon Musk right in front of the White House. The guy's basically turned the presidency into a cross between QVC and a garage sale. At this rate, I wouldn't be surprised if the next State of the Union address comes with a promo code. But it gets worse. Multiple reports have raised serious questions about possible market manipulation by Trump and his inner circle, especially around tariffs. Trump posted on Truth Social, "This is a great time to buy," just hours before making a surprise reversal on new tariffs. Markets surged, and critics began asking whether the real trade strategy was financial self-interest. Some observers have even floated a new definition for taco. It's not Trump always chickens out, but Trump always cashes out. That's the kind of pattern that would trigger SEC investigations under any other administration. But with watchdogs defunded and oversight gutted, it's happening in broad daylight with a wink, a smirk, and a Truth Social post. And then there's the Trump family's crypto empire. Just before inauguration, they rolled out Trump-themed crypto tokens. After taking office, Trump signed executive orders boosting the crypto market, gutting regulations, and even declaring a national digital reserve. Not surprisingly, the value of his family's cryptocurrency has skyrocketed. So now the President of the United States is personally profiting from economic policy that he controls. Let that sink in. Let's not forget the plane. Yes, the plane. Trump received a $400 million Boeing 747 gift from Qatar. Technically, it was for the U.S. Defense Department, but somehow Trump's name keeps popping up next to it. If past presidents get libraries, well, then Trump gets his own flying palace with gold-plated cup holders. If all of this sounds like something out of a banana republic, you're not wrong. That's our federal government under the Trump regime. Ethics watchdogs and constitutional scholars have called it one of the clearest examples of self-dealing in American history. And what's so shocking is how public it all is. No backroom deals, just open monetization of the presidency, like it's a brand, which of course to Trump, it's always been. So where does that leave us, the American people, including those who voted for Trump, who believed he would bring down the cost of living for working class folks? Well, if the history of American kleptocracy has taught us anything, it's this. Reform doesn't happen automatically. It comes after exposure, after outrage, and crucially, after accountability. Whether that means action from Congress, the courts, or us, the people. One thing is clear, kleptocracy isn't coming, it's already here. What happened to the guardrails? Aren't there laws against this? Ethics clauses, checks and balances? To help us unpack this, I spoke with Garrett West, a local attorney and constitutional scholar. We talked about what the Constitution actually says about corruption, how those protections were meant to work, and why they're struggling to hold up in Trump's second term. We also got into what Congress, the courts, and the public can still do about it. Here's that conversation. Hi, Garrett. Thanks for talking with me today.
Hi, Rhonda. Thanks so much for having me.
So to start us off, I want to know, how does U.S. law define corruption or self-enrichment in office? And at what point does it cross over into criminal or unconstitutional behavior?
So the American legal system has a vast array of definitions for corrupt behavior. There are constitutional provisions that prohibit corruption, and there are various federal statutes, state statutes meant to safeguard against it. You can basically think of corruption meaning using public power for private gain. So that could be a politician or a public employee who's leveraging their office to get themselves enrichment for their family or even for their close associates, their business partners or friends. Within the Constitution, there are two emoluments clauses meant to prevent federal officers from getting payments that are not authorized by Congress.
So where does it all break down, Garrett?
The problem with a legal system of any kind is that laws are only enforceable if people are enforcing them. If you look at the constitutional clauses, they're very clear to anyone who reads them. They say that no person holding any office or profit or trust under the United States shall accept any present, any emolument, any office or any title, whatever, from any king, prince, or foreign state without the consent of Congress. Basically, that means no federal official can get anything of value from a foreign government without Congress okaying it. And Congress can only okay it by passing a resolution authorized by both houses of Congress. How it breaks down is when a foreign government gifts a federal official something, for example, gifts the president something of many millions of dollars of value.
The plane.
Like a giant jumbo jet, right? Just presenting it to our commander in chief and saying, this is a gift. And Congress does not authorize that, right? And no one does anything about it. No charges are filed, no suits are brought in courts. And if charges were filed or suits were brought, the courts would refuse to hear that kind of suit. When people choose not to act or choose to bury these kind of things, that's where we start seeing a systematic breakdown.
While the liberal media and Democrats are wringing their hands over whether or not we are in a constitutional crisis, all of this is going on, which points to the fact that we are beyond a constitutional crisis. We are in a constitutional collapse.
Yes, there are many levers that people in power could pull at a time like this to help right our ship. And they're just not. They're refusing to do it. They're looking the other way. If you'll think back many months ago to when people filed suit against Donald Trump's candidacy, saying he was not qualified to be elected because he had engaged in insurrection, you saw many courts, like the Oregon Supreme Court, which refused to even consider the question and instead punted that to the Supreme Court, even though the Constitution is very clear that the qualifications for election can be decided by the states themselves, right? And so you see deep blue states, people who have sworn to uphold the federal Constitution and the state constitutions, and they just bury their head in the sand and say, well, we've always punted to the U.S. Supreme Court. And that's the kind of cowering it just feeds into the constitutional breakdown.
So the U.S. Constitution includes, as you said, provisions like the foreign and domestic emoluments clauses. Can you explain what those clauses are meant to prevent and how they apply to modern examples like Donald Trump receiving that $400 million jet from Qatar?
Yes. So you'll hear these clauses talked about in the media a lot, the emoluments clauses. And that's kind of a funny word because we never use the word emoluments outside of this kind of discussion.
That is so true for many of the terms that are coming to the forefront during the Trump administration that we never heard of. Kleptocracy, one of them, but emoluments certainly another.
Yeah, it's kind of unfortunate because it's such a legalese term. It's very archaic. Basically, an emolument is a gift. It's profit. Something of immense value. And there's two separate clauses in the Constitution. There are very few places in the Constitution where it needs to be said twice, right? Article 1, Section 9, you have the broad prohibition. No person in office gets to accept a profit or a gift or an emolument from a foreign country or king without the consent of Congress. So if you go on a state visit to the United Kingdom and the king and queen want to gift you a set of candles, you can't accept it. You can accept it on behalf of the country, and then it goes to the National Archives or a museum, but you don't get to keep it unless Congress passes a resolution.
We're talking about candles, not a jumbo jet. This is what I mean by just the level of kleptocracy and the blatantness.
Yes. I don't know if you've ever seen the show The West Wing. It was one of the shows that I grew up on. It takes place in the West Wing of the White House and follows the various staffers as they try to guide the country through various crises. And in one of the episodes, a staffer received a gift basket of ham or something. Laughable. The staffer gifted it to an intern, saying, here, because of some clause, you can have this and we'll pay the charge. That intern turned around and put it on eBay. And it caused a scandal. And now, of course, in real life, we're talking about, $500 million planes.
So, why do you think that Congress has decided to completely abdicate their power and their responsibility to their constituents over to the executive branch?
Well, at the beginning of the Republic, the idea of having separate branches of government was that the branches would be pitted against each other. Having three separate branches would always cause one of the other branches to play referee for the other two. By having different entities with different powers, you would prevent the consolidation of power. That worked for 200 plus years. Now we have people in office, mostly in Congress, who don't view their responsibility as preventing the consolidation of power in another branch. They view their responsibility as to their political party over country.
It seems to be to a particular individual, Donald
Yep.
J. Trump.
You're right. It's a cult of personality wrapped in the clothing of political party, right? So many members of Congress who are Republican, probably virtually all of them, see their only chance at reelection and staying in office is if they do whatever they're told from the White House, even if it's against their better judgment. In the history of the country, we've always been able to have branches pitted against each other. And that kind of chaos, that kind of fighting solved many of our problems. With this, you have lockstep across the branches to violate the Constitution. If and when the Democrats get back in power, they actually have to do something. They actually have to hold corrupt officials accountable. That doesn't mean you continue with the same judges that were appointed. It doesn't mean that because the previous administration didn't prosecute, that you don't too. The Democrats often accept unwritten rules as being as highly important as the Constitution and the stability of the Republic. These are the norms we've always followed. Therefore, we're commanded to do the same.
I agree with that. If there is one thing that Donald Trump has done in service of the American people, it is to very clearly highlight the gaps in our honor system of governance, the
Yeah.
norms that you're talking about. They no longer apply in 21st century politics.
Yes,
And
exactly.
it reminds me of after the Watergate scandal, all of the legislation that came about as a way to close up those gaps.
Exactly. Norms and how political systems work are normal in other countries. If you look at the United Kingdom, most, if not all, of their constitutional system is based on tradition and norms, right? They don't have a single written constitution on a piece of paper. They have many centuries of traditions and norms. And that's important. But when you see a political movement that just wipes all those away, that's when you need to implement new safeguards in black and white. That's when you need to install new political officials and new government officials who will enforce anti-corruption laws.
Beyond the Constitution, what are some other laws or ethics rules that are designed to prevent kleptocracy at the federal level?
There are a complex web of federal statutes and rules. There are attorneys who are dedicated in their entire profession to these kind of statutes. There's the bribery statutes in 18 USC section 201. There's the honest services fraud statutes, which is section 1346. Conflict of interest statutes, section 208. They're everywhere. Basically, they are meant to prevent public power being used for private gain, prevent quid pro quo. The founders and the framers were very aware of corruption and the potential for corruption in government. They experienced those kind of scandals throughout their entire lives, from their childhoods under the British Empire, seeing the king's ministers appropriating public funds for their own gains, to imperial officers doing the same, people who lived extravagant, wealthy lives in power compared to the common British subject. And then they saw corruption in the revolution. Various people would steal resources and money from the public and the Continental Army for their own use, which damaged our war effort against the British Crown. They saw it once they had framed the Constitution and established the federal government, when Alexander Hamilton was wrongly accused of embezzlement and corruption. That was something that occurred all the time in their lives. So they understood it, and they put in various safeguards. They gave Congress vast powers to prevent corruptions. And over the centuries, Congress has made use of those powers by passing a web of laws to protect the public from kleptocracy, from embezzlers, from fraudsters. Those protections and powers still exist on paper. Over the course of the years, Congress has abdicated their responsibility to protect the public from those kind of things. They will not look into corruption unless it's against their political enemies. Then you'll look at the judiciary, and those people who occupy judicial seats have, little by little, chiseled away at the web of protections to say that statute doesn't actually mean what it says it means. Or that prohibition against bribery, well, it does say that, but no one can actually enforce it because of some made-up legal theory that they'll insert for that particular statute. The Constitution and the laws are only as good and are only as powerful as we collectively make them.
You made an excellent point when you said that this has happened incrementally. And so people have become inured to the reality of kleptocracy. I also think it's important for people to understand that it's not just about the government officials enriching themselves. It's also about taking money and services and security away from the people.
Yeah, these are public resources. When you see members of the Supreme Court accept gifts from wealthy donors, and they rule on that wealthy donor's case to ensure there's a tax loophole for them or to prevent public punishment for their businesses, those are public resources. Either they're resources allocated to the government itself or they're resources in general for the public. And because that's really what public power is, right? It's a collective, where are we going to shift resources around? And when you engage in corruption, not just for yourself or your family, but for your business associates or for wealthy donors, that wealth has to come from somewhere. It doesn't just magically appear. It usually comes from the public treasury, whether it's physically in the Treasury building or somewhere else.
In 2024, you know that the Supreme Court ruled that presidents are immune from criminal prosecution for so-called official acts. In your view, how does that decision impact legal accountability for self-enrichment or grifting in office?
Trump v. United States, and this is the 2024 Supreme Court case because I know there's been so many cases called Trump v. US. This case basically prevents any president from being held accountable for any illegal actions ever.
Just think about how wide-reaching that is.
It's an extraordinary case. You'll often see this Supreme Court harken back to medieval history and laws from the British Isles, from the monarchy. But even in the United Kingdom, the king is not above the law, right? And here, the United States Supreme Court has basically said, our president is above the law. Our president is above a king. That's shocking. Any of the great judicial heroes in the history of our country would be flabbergasted at the very idea because it undermines the entire constitutional system. Everyone is below the law except the president. So there's this one individual who's allowed to do anything whatsoever. This case said there are three types of actions a president could do. And depending on what type of action it was, it determines the president's immunity from prosecution. There's absolute immunity, presumed immunity, and no immunity. Now, this is kind of a hard system to describe because the court just made it up. The entire system of our law is dependent either on Congress passing a law and having it written down, or the courts interpreting those laws little by little over time. Courts are not meant to create entire schemes of law single-handedly in one go. That is a recipe for disaster. Absolute immunity, they said, applies to when presidents do something in their core constitutional powers. I can imagine many constitutional powers that the president could exercise that they should be immune from. Signing legislation, the president should be immune for signing legislation. Giving a speech, the president should be immune for giving a speech. But the problem is, what if they're doing those things corruptly? The president has the power to grant pardons. And the Supreme Court has said the president can grant pardons to anyone for any reason whatsoever, and they can't be prosecuted for that. At first glance, that kind of makes sense. You shouldn't be able to prosecute someone for doing their job. But what if the president was bribed? What if the president received several $1,000,000 in cash in view of the cameras and said, "Thank you for your money. I am now going to grant you a pardon because you gave me all this money." Now, the Supreme Court in this decision has said there's absolute immunity for that because granting a pardon is a core constitutional power of the president, even though they're doing it corruptly. The Supreme Court is meant to have some of the smartest people on earth on it. And the fact that they couldn't think 2 steps down the road about what this case would mean is shocking.
It just has opened up this Pandora's box of corruption in government. First, America elects a convicted felon, a known fraudster, to be president. Then he comes into office, and we've got a Supreme Court decision that allows him to be a king, more than a king, as you said, and pretty much do whatever he wants to do. How could we not think that there's going to be this level of corruption and kleptocracy that we have never seen before in America?
Absolutely. It's hard to understand where the Supreme Court was coming from in this case from a reasonable point of view, because from a legal perspective, it doesn't make any sense. I have many constitutional scholars that I respect, and I've heard what they've said about this case. I've read what they've written about this case, and no one understands it. These are people who have spent their entire lives dedicated to constitutional interpretation. And this was completely out of left field. The dissents from the Supreme Court have been crystal clear on all these cases. I am confident that history will look very finely on those dissents. But it often feels like they're shouting into the wind. The majority on the Supreme Court just either ignores them or says, "Oh, no, that's not true. Just trust us."
Do civil suits offer any meaningful way to address kleptocracy, or are stronger criminal or legislative tools needed?
In general, the solution to these kind of things would be, let's file a lawsuit. Let's go to a court and have a judge issue an order saying, no, you can't do that. No, you cannot accept a bribe from a foreign government. Slowly but surely, over the years, courts have gutted our ability to go to court, to stand before them and say, there is a massive problem, judge, please give me redress. And so what the courts have done in these kind of cases is they've said that petitioners lack standing to come to a court. Standing basically means that you have been injured, right? You've actually suffered harm or are about to suffer harm. And you need to go to a court to have redress, to have some kind of cure for that harm. The courts have interpreted this rule to mean that you can't have just been generally injured along with many other people. Your injury needs to have been particularized. Your injury must be special. So if a constitutional officer is accepting bribes from a foreign government, well, how does that harm you in particular as opposed to everyone else? And if you can't articulate or explain how, you can't even go to court. And this kind of framework, this kind of legal theory that's been created, I mean, they just created it out of thin air. This particularized requirement isn't in the Constitution anywhere. And so they've done it on purpose because the courts do not want to have to look into these kind of cases. They want to ignore them altogether. We can hypothesize about the various reasonings for that. But ultimately, if we filed a case today in federal court to stop Donald Trump from accepting a $500 million bribe from the Kingdom of Qatar, it would be dismissed. And no judge would grant us any kind of redress because they would say, you might be harmed by having a corrupt government. You might be harmed by having someone steal $500 million from the United States because a gift of that magnitude is a public gift. But because you in particular have not been harmed, we will use that as an excuse not to have to deal with this.
We have developed a system where our president is basically unimpeachable.
The safeguards against the executive branch do not exist. I cannot think of one. Impeachment doesn't work. Civil suits don't work. Criminal charges don't work. I don't know what protections exist anymore.
Scary.
The president has the most power on earth. The president commands the strongest military force in the history of the world. And there's no safeguards against that. If this is how our constitutional framework is evolving, you should be terrified about the person who holds the office 3 presidents from now, 4 presidents from now, a generation.
I agree.
That's what happened in Rome. We have plenty of historical examples of how constitutional breakdown ends up.
By the public allowing this kleptocracy to continue, we are simply taking that money away from our own children and relegating our children to pay an enormous debt that we're accruing now. It all seems to be part of this whole, let's keep enriching the rich and making the American middle class shrink even further.
And that's borne out by the data. In Oregon, I have many friends, early 30s, very few of them own homes. That's a major problem. They're thinking, man, okay, if I pay off my student loans by the time I'm 40, mid-40s, maybe I'm going to be able to buy an entry-level home. Or you look at the big, beautiful bill that was just passed by Congress, and it limits the amount of student loans you're allowed to take out. It's creating caps for people who want to be doctors, lawyers, teachers. You're not going to see the immediate effects of that this year. But a decade from now, when we have doctor shortages, because all those people who wanted to be doctors couldn't go to medical school because they couldn't afford it, we're going to have massive problems.
And that, to me, is a new form of kleptocracy. It's enriching political leaders while making American people poor.
Exactly. Student loans are meant for people in the middle class to be able to get an education, given the time and work to improve their lives, to give back to the country as a whole. And now we're limiting that, while at the same time giving massive tax breaks to people who are insanely wealthy. It doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't. And again, what makes me so disgusted is that people seem to be going along with this. Just the cynicism of people today thinking, oh, well, we've always had that, so why not a little bit more? When, as it's turned out, a lot more.
That's the classic response. They're all corrupt, and therefore my team deserves to be corrupt even more. We're in this situation where many people view their political party as a sports team. This is my team. This is who I root for. They don't understand those political parties have value structures that result in real life outcomes. They view it on TV and they think it's entertainment. And they don't realize that that actually has impacts on them.
Let's talk a little bit more about fixing some of this. What reforms would you most like to see to strengthen guardrails against kleptocracy at all levels of government?
Number one, we need a new Judiciary Act. We need new judges in office who can interpret things in a way that's opposed to corruption and a kleptocracy. That's the first major step we could take to reverse this kind of cancer on our system. There's a wide array of things that Congress is empowered to do. Congress could create an independent agency whose entire job would be to find corruption and to prosecute. Congress could pass strong emolument laws with teeth and give private citizens standing in court to say, okay, Congress isn't doing their job, but this public official just accepted a $500 million bribe. I'm going to haul them into court, and I have a right to haul them into court. We could update the bribery laws to create lower standards. So it doesn't have to be a letter saying, I hereby bribe you. It could just be like, clearly that person just accepted a gift and now they're giving something to that person too. That's corruption. There's all these things that we could do, but it takes good people in office to do them. It takes a loud public who's going to constantly tell their public officials they do not want a corrupt government and to hold them accountable at the ballot box. We could have real-time financial disclosures. Oregon has a really good system of financial disclosures. I'm a public office holder. Anytime I receive a gift or money or anything from my political campaign, I have to log it in the state registry in Orstar. And you can go on there and you can see all my donations. You can see all my expenditures in that system. It's very transparent. The federal system is much more cumbersome and complex and meant to give a little bit of transparency while shrouding a lot more.
I wanted to ask you, because you are a real estate lawyer, about reforms in laws pertaining to buying real estate. Because anonymous entities can buy up real estate, that seems to be an open door for laundering money and facilitating kleptocracy.
Yeah, so I don't see the corruption every day, but I see hints of it in the real estate industry. The biggest one is I might be researching a property and come across its deed. And the deed will say, this property is conveyed to this corporation. Now, a good deed would say, we'll call it Corporation X LLC, which is a limited liability company in the state of Oregon. Then I take that information, go to the Oregon Secretary of State website, and look up that corporation. And I could see who created it, who its registered agent is. I'd likely be able to see who its members are or its directors, things of that nature. That's very transparent. But sometimes in a deed, I will just see such and such conveys this property to X LLC. And it won't say the state of where that LLC was created. So I don't know what state this LLC was created. We have 50 states, plus the District of Columbia, plus Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, the Marshall Islands. I'm not going to be able to find that corporation. And if I did, then I might be able to look up some information. But if it's incorporated in Delaware, for example, I'm never going to know who owns that corporation. They intentionally hide the owners of their corporations, and they make a lot of money in Delaware off doing so, because so many people want to incorporate in Delaware to prevent that transparency. In the state of Oregon, we have property taxes. You have to pay property tax every year on property you own. But in other states that don't have property taxes, a corporation could own a piece of property. We don't know who owns it. They don't have to pay property taxes on it. So there's never going to be a check conveyed to the local government every year signed by someone. It's completely anonymous. And those properties can be traded around like securities or bonds because the property is worth something. There's no national registry of property transfers or anything like that. If you're going through lending institutions, there are different Patriot Act safeguards. But if you're not getting a mortgage, those safeguards go away. There might be laws saying you can't convey property to foreign nationals in certain circumstances, but you don't need to, you could still do the deed. It might not be legal, but no one's ever going to look into it. And there have been attempts at reforming these kind of activities. The Corporate Transparency Act was supposed to come in and say, at the very least, if you own or are part of a corporation or other entity, you need to disclose who your owners are to a certain office of the federal government. And I had to do all kinds of work to prepare my clients for that. But the Trump administration came in and they basically said, pause, we're going to ignore this. And so no one passed to comply with that kind of Transparency Act anymore. We've tried to engage in reforms. They're not working because the reforms don't really have teeth.
What do you know about things that have gone on here in Jackson County that could qualify as kleptocracy, and how has that been addressed, if at all?
I'm in a lot of meetings with public officials behind closed doors. I have not seen any corruption locally. If I did, I would shout it from the rooftops and I would put together an action plan to make sure that that corruption was rooted out. I think we are very lucky in Southern Oregon because our leadership across both parties is focused on the public good. And there are a lot of bipartisan conversations that happen all the time on how do we advance the public good. I'll take the Medford City Council, for example, of which I'm a member. I'm a Democrat. There's 2 Democrats on there. There's 6 non-Democrats on there. We generally enjoy consensus on our decisions. And every meeting that I have been in regards to the public business has always been focused on how does this improve the public good. When I meet with other cities led by Democrats or Republicans, or with the county or any agency or district, that is always the theme of the meetings. How do we advance the public good? We are very fortunate locally in the Rogue Valley to enjoy that kind of safety net of local leadership. Not to say there isn't corruption, but if it exists right now, I haven't seen it and it's not blatant. I feel confident that people in our local leadership would react to anything of that nature.
Well, I would hope so. Garrett, if an ordinary citizen suspects that a public official is abusing their position for personal gain, what legal options are available to them to take action or demand accountability?
You can file a complaint with the Oregon Office of Government Ethics. You could file a complaint with the federal version of that. You can write to other public officials saying, hey, I suspect something is wrong. You can engage in Freedom of Information Act requests through the federal government or public records requests locally to see if there's documents that substantiate your concerns. If you think something is wrong, you can write to the newspaper. The more people who are aware of a situation, the better. Oftentimes, people come to me in my role as a public official and say, why aren't you doing X? X has been going on for so long. I can't believe you're not doing anything about it. And this is the first time I've heard about it. This person who clearly has seen it many times, and I had no idea. No one told me. If people in my orbit don't know about it, how can I fix it?
Right. How do you think people getting involved in grassroots organizations like ORD2 Indivisible addresses the issue of holding our government leaders accountable for not engaging in kleptocracy?
I think it is one of the strongest things a citizen or a resident can do is to be involved with other people, because your power to make change multiplies many times when you're part of a group. If you're just a single person, you can be shouting into the wind. If you're a large group of people, you can make change happen. Even if you don't see the change immediately, it wears down public officials when they have a group of people demanding that they do something or not do something. So I know many people call Congressman Bence's office, for example, daily or weekly, and it often feels like he's not doing anything, but I bet that that is wearing him down. That is wearing his staff down, that they are aware that there is a group of people who will be very loud when he does something wrong. And that can embarrass him. That will go into the calculus he makes when he makes decisions.
I think that's good advice. I want to make sure that we talk about anything else related to this issue that you think is important for our listeners to know.
I think to sum everything up, corruption has happened throughout human history. We have safeguards on paper to prevent corruption in our country, but it takes normal, ordinary people either running for office and using those powers to prevent corruption, or ordinary citizens pressuring public officials to stop corruption. Anti-corruption advocacy is something people need to dedicate their lives to. It must consistently be in their mind.
What I hear you saying is that we cannot afford to believe that there are other watchdogs out there. We have to become the watchdogs ourselves.
Exactly. There's no one who's going to save us except ourselves. People who have grown up in the United States often think that democracy is the default form of government because it's all we have ever known. The default form of government is autocracy and monarchy, and we must work every day to prevent that from happening. Democracy is a consistent project.
Well, thank you, Garrett, for reminding us that democracy is not just a noun. It's not just a thing. It's a verb. It's an action. It's something that happens or doesn't happen every day.
Exactly. Democracy takes work all the time, throughout the generations from now and forever. It's not something we can just rest on. So thanks so much for having me.
All right. Well, thanks for being here. My conversation with Garrett really brings home how fragile our constitutional safeguards can be when they're not fully enforced, or when those in power simply choose to ignore them. But many Americans are not ignoring Trump's blatant kleptocracy. To drive this point home, here's another segment of Rogue on the Road, where I go on the hunt for acts of creative resistance to Trump's authoritarianism and his kleptocratic governance. Fellow Oregonians, I'm out here in the streets again in search of acts of creative resistance. It's Good Trouble Day, a national protest inspired by the late, great John Lewis, who never gave up on democracy. So naturally, I had to see what kind of trouble was brewing locally. Since I've come across a brigade of banner bearers stretched across Interstate 5. And here's even more signage across the interstate. So, what's your name?
My name's Doug Houston.
What made you decide to spend your morning waving a banner above a freeway instead of doing something relaxing like screaming in a pillow about the demise of democracy?
Well, I retired in January and didn't expect to have to be worried about the ability of our government and our country, but that's what we got right now. And so I have the time to do it, and I certainly have the willingness.
What ticks you off the most? Is it the racism, the authoritarianism, or the fact that Trump's golf caddies are better funded now than public education?
Reminds me of my kids in middle school asking these terrible dilemmas. Would you rather be eaten by snakes or beaten by a rhinoceros? It's hard to rank everything. I'm really most worried about democracy in our country, I'd say.
And how do you think holding up a banner helps?
I grew up with a dad active in the civil rights movement, often out on Sunday afternoons protesting. And so I think that although you never know how a certain action is going to land, I think that it makes a difference. Important for people to be able to express their outrage and unhappiness.
Well, thank you, Doug. We all appreciate you for standing up for democracy.
Thank you.
Hello,
What's your name?
it's Russ Whitman.
Hi, Russ. So what are you doing out here today?
I'm trying to promote democracy in the best way I can and illustrate my unhappiness with the current administration.
So what makes you the most mad about this regime that we're dealing with?
Well, mainly Donald Trump.
Yeah.
First off, I'm from New Jersey and I grew up hearing his name. And I knew what a piece of crap he was from the first day. And in fact, my sister and brother-in-law both voted for him. And it took them about 3 months to realize the error of their ways. And at least they came around.
Why do you think holding up a banner across the freeway helps?
Because it brings attention to everybody's problems. And you have a lot of people going by, and it also gives me hope because of the positive response that we get from other individuals.
So you're getting a positive response?
Yes, every now and then we get a few of these, but we get mostly thumbs up or fist pumps or, just beeping.
That's wonderful. That's got to feel good.
It does.
I really like your shirts.
And my hat,
How do you think Trump has screwed the veterans?
any way he possibly can. He does not care a thing about anyone but himself and his own deep pockets.
But what about veterans specifically?
I feel sorry for people that have to go to White City for treatments because I have friends that work at the facilities there, and they say that the things that they can do for people are becoming less and less because of funding.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being out here. I mean, it's getting warm right now, and here you are still smiling. Way to go, Russ. We all appreciate you. And there you have it, folks, our roadside revolutionaries. They're making good trouble, one banner, one honk, and one freeway at a time. Americans are learning that kleptocracy thrives when power goes unchecked and truth gets buried beneath fear and propaganda. But history also shows us something else. Corruption can be exposed, and it can be challenged by journalists, whistleblowers, reformers, and everyday citizens who refuse to look the other way. If you're ready to speak out, get organized, and push back against government kleptocracy, join us at ORD2 Indivisible. We're building power in Southern Oregon through civic action, creative resistance, and a commitment to democracy that cannot be bought. Remember, government officials can only get away with corruption if we let them. Thanks for listening to this episode of Rogue Resistance. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay indivisible.